merci beaucoup. Je m'excuse d'interrompre votre dîner, mais c'est ce qu'on m'a demandé de faire. Je voudrais remercier la faculté de droit de l'Université Laval et Gabriel Marceau pour l'initiative en organisant cette conférence. Je pense que c'est la seule conférence organisée au Canada pour commémorer en effet le 20e anniversaire de l'OMC. Et alors merci beaucoup, parce que je crois que ça c'est quelque chose vraiment important et je suis heureux que quelqu'un ait pris le défi de le faire. J'ai beaucoup apprécié l'occasion d'être présent hier soir pendant les propos de mon collègue Germain Denis. C'est clair qu'il a joué un rôle clé en assistant les négociateurs à finir avec succès le cycle du Uruguay. Et Germain a parlé hier, vous vous souvenez de l'importance de la confiance entre négociateurs. Et je dirais aussi que cette importance d'avoir confiance dans le président qui pas mène, mais assiste les négociateurs à trouver des solutions. Et c'est cette confiance entre négociateurs et dans le président, qui à l'époque c'était Germain Denis, je pense que c'était essentiel pour permettre les négociations d'aboutir dans une réussite et pour créer l'Organisation mondiale du commerce. I'm here today thanks to the Laval Faculty of Law and Gabrielle, but also thanks to Mr. Harper, because he decided to call an election and to tell all of his senior officials that they could no longer make public appearances. So had that event not occurred, John Freed would be standing here today speaking to you. And instead it is I. I must say, I picked up the opportunity to do this very quickly, but I thought I'm certainly not going to try to compete with John Freed by sticking to the subject as it had originally been described. So I asked if I could speak to the next 20 years. And I thought at a conference like this that's looking back at the past of the organization, where we've come from, it's important also to be looking to the future. And I thought that seemed like a very good idea when I suggested it. And then over the last few days, as I get ready to speak, I'm beginning to wonder whether that wasn't really a bit foolish to say that I'd take that on. But anyway, I've done it. So let me say that the WTO, I think to look at the future, you really need to look at where we've come from and where we are today, and then look ahead. So let me take a brief look at the WTO today. We've already heard a lot of discussion about the functioning of the dispute settlement system, and I think it's very clear that that's an area where the WTO has been particularly successful, perhaps beyond anybody's imagination as to how successful the new system that was created in the Uruguay round would actually be. I think another area where the WTO has been successful, although not completely successful, is in the field of helping resist protectionist pressures, particularly in the period after the financial crisis in 2008. And the WTO, for instance, adopted some very innovative new techniques for monitoring developments in the field of trade, building on the provisions of the trade policy review mechanism. And that has been, I think, very helpful in terms of helping to control and through public scrutiny the number of new measures that were taken by governments in response to the crisis. Then I turn to the negotiating function of the WTO. And here I think the record is much less satisfactory. Now there have been some successes. We've seen the process of negotiating accessions to the WTO has proceeded in a very vigorous manner and has included such major countries as China, the number 1 or 2 trader in the world today, Russia, and a number of other countries. We've seen agreement as part of the Doha round negotiations on a trade facilitation agreement. Again, there, I think that that's a significant development, an important development, and really I think the first fully multilateral accord that the WTO has completed that wasn't directly related to something left over from the end of the Uruguay round negotiations. Then there's the Information Technology Agreement, which was originally concluded some time ago but has recently been expanded. The Government Procurement Agreement, to which reference was made in our last session, has been recently expanded in terms of membership and enlarged in terms of coverage and improved in terms of its provisions. There are negotiations going on a plurilateral level looking at removing tariffs on green goods. And we have the Trade and Services negotiations, the so-called TISA, Trade and Services Agreement negotiations, taking place in Geneva. Although here that's a bit of a mixed blessing, because although those negotiations are taking place in Geneva, and although their point of departure is the services agreement in the WTO, those negotiations are actually taking place outside the WTO among 25 countries. And I think it would clearly be more satisfactory if they were taking place inside, but clearly the members engaged in those negotiations have so far decided not to do the negotiations in that way. Now, I haven't said anything except briefly by reference to the Doha Development Agenda. And this is the negotiations, of course, that the WTO embarked upon, the first WTO negotiating round, embarked upon in 2001. And clearly, these negotiations are languishing. It had been hoped that a work plan would be developed by the end of July in the General Council in Geneva on how to bring these negotiations to a conclusion at the ministerial conference in Nairobi later this year. I don't think the prospects for achieving agreement in Nairobi this year are particularly good. Why is that? Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but one obvious reason is that there hasn't been a meeting of minds among the major countries about how to bring these negotiations to a conclusion. And that starts with the fact that there's no meeting of minds between the United States and China. And I think we heard yesterday some reference to the fact there are 161 members in the WTO and how this makes it so difficult to do business and get anything agreed. I don't really think it's the number of members in the WTO that make that difficult. What makes it difficult is the fact that there are disagreements among the 5 or 10 largest members. And if those difficulties could be overcome, I think it would be quite easy to figure out how to deal with some of the important issues that other members of the WTO attach importance to and bring those negotiations to a conclusion. So I've never been one of those people who think that the WTO doesn't work because it's too big. Another, and I think actually perhaps more fundamental problem with why these negotiations have not been successful is a lack of adequate preparation. And here, let me go back and talk about the period before the Uruguay round began and look at the kind of preparatory work that was engaged in at that time. In the early 1980s, there was a big push, particularly from the American business community, to look at bringing so-called new issues into the GATT, as it was then. Prominent among those were trade and services, which clearly was becoming more important, and intellectual property matters. Starting to look more at a business agenda rather than just a trade agenda. And the WTO ministerial meeting in 1982 was really a turning point. The Americans in particular came to that meeting hoping to push these new issues into the GATT system, at least in terms of a work program, and to begin working towards a new round. Some people even think that meeting was supposed to establish a new round of negotiations, but I don't recall that from my participation at it. The meeting was considered at the time by most observers to have been a failure. But what it actually did was launch a very vigorous work program that I think led directly to the initiation of the Uruguay round in 1986. Now, one of the important things about this work program was it was not just taking place in the GATT. It was taking place in academia, it was taking place in business circles, it was taking place in other international organizations like the OECD, the UNCTAD, and it was taking place informally at various conferences involving an interaction between ministers, business people, academics, and this gradually began to build up a sense of direction and a convergence on what the objectives of a new round of negotiations should be. Now, some of the issues in this work program were, of course, things that found their way later into techniques for solving the negotiation. There was work on the production subsidy equivalent in agriculture in the OECD, which probably contributed more or less directly to the eventual agreement on tariffication as a way of helping to bring the agricultural negotiations to a conclusion. There was a lot of work on intellectual property and how that might be addressed in terms of bringing it into a trade agreement. There was work on trade and services and thinking about how would you actually address the issues that arise in the conduct of trade and services, which is quite different from trade and goods, and especially since investment is one of the main modes through which services is delivered. How would you address these issues in a GATT negotiation? So there was a lot of work that went into that, a lot of original thinking, a lot of effort. When we launched the Doha round, I still say we, even though I wasn't there. I'm thinking of the world community or those interested in the trading system. When we launched the Doha round in 2001, we hadn't seen any of that kind of original preparation. In fact, the Doha round, to a large extent, was a continuation of the Uruguay round, because the first two key elements of it, the negotiations in agriculture and the negotiations in services, were both obligations that the WTO members incurred in the Uruguay round, and those negotiations had already been initiated before we got to Doha. What happened in Doha was the scope of the negotiations was enlarged somewhat. But it was a kind of, and of course it happened in 2011, about what, 3-4 months after 9/11. And I think one of the reasons people sort of rushed into launching a negotiation at that point was to show a sense of common purpose in the face of that kind of crisis. But it hadn't necessarily been properly prepared in terms of the groundwork. Now, a lot of things, of course, you know, the Uruguay round work program was looking at was designing ideas to deal with a world as it existed in 1980. By the time we got to the start of the Doha round in 2001, 21 years later, I would argue that we were still running basically on the intellectual capital that had been put together in the run-up to the Uruguay round, even though 21 years had elapsed. Now, 14 years later, we're still trying to finish the Doha round. It's now 35 years since we really did the last major think about how to approach the problems of the trading system. Is it any wonder that we're having problems? Now, it won't surprise you to hear me say at this point that I think what is needed is an active program of new thinking to look at how we move matters forward. Now, let me talk a little bit about bilateralism and regionalism, because of course in this sort of vacuum created by the WTO and the languishing of its negotiating function, we've seen a whole plethora of negotiations. And this process of all these negotiations has been described by some as competitive trade liberalization, which is a bit of a dangerous game, because if you don't get out there first and get into negotiating agreements with your principal partners ahead of your competitors, you're going to be locked out. And we've seen, and discrimination will result. And we've seen the kind of problems that can come about here and what happened to Canada in the Korean market. And I could go on much longer on this, but I won't, because I have to finish this relatively quickly. We've heard a lot of talk about 21st century trade agreements. It's sort of suggesting that, you know, the WTO is passé and everything like the NAFTA is kind of useless and we really need to look to the future. Well, so and of course, among these 21st century trade agreements are two mega regional negotiations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and the TTIP, so-called Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations between the EU and the United States. Now, I see some new issues in these negotiations, but mind you, it's a little hard to see what's going on because they're taking place in a pretty secretive fashion. But frankly, not as many new issues as you might think would be required to really be a good 21st century model trade agreement. We're seeing such issues as state-owned enterprises addressed in the TPP, and a lot of talk about the importance of labor and environment as issues in the TPP. Well, you know, we put labor and environment in the NAFTA, as I recall, not in the NAFTA itself, but in the side agreements. And I'm not sure how many new provisions are going to be on labor and environment in the TPP as compared with the NAFTA. Perhaps the only real difference will be that those agreements will be inside the new trade agreement rather than as side agreements, which is going to carry with it the baggage that the dispute settlement system of the TPP, the general dispute settlement system, will be used for resolving disputes under labor and environment, which some people see as a good thing, but Canada strongly resisted that in the NAFTA, because we were worried about arming the United States with any new techniques to use innovative trade remedy actions against Canada. But anyway, I think we're going to wind up in this new world where we will have that system. Now, the other thing that these 21st century trade agreements have as a problem is that they're not really dealing with all of the older issues that are still important. And so these issues are tending to be neglected, at least in the regional negotiations. And I just will cite two. One is the whole area of agricultural support programs, which is very important for anybody in the agricultural business, and trade remedies, anti-dumping and countervailing duties. You can't deal with these kinds of issues in a bilateral or regional agreement. They really only lend themselves to global solutions. Now let me anecdotally comment on how it would seem perhaps that the TPP negotiators are having some difficulty squaring this new trade agreement with the way in which business is actually conducted in the 21st century. And as an example, I'd like to refer to the difficulties that have been run into on rules of origin for the automobile sector in the TPP negotiations. And what this says to me is that basically the way in which TPP countries are now doing business is across a wider geographic area in terms of their global supply chains than the coverage of the TPP participants. And it also, of course, means that potentially the TPP is going to, when brought into force, will have some trade diversion effects. But let me also say it, I'm commenting on how companies seem to be doing business differently. And I seem to recall during the NAFTA negotiations that the Ford Motor Company wanted the rules of origin under NAFTA for the automobile sector to be 75% for passenger vehicles. Now, what the United States just agreed with Japan in the TPP was 45% and 30% for parts. Now, Canada and Mexico are apparently trying to push them back, and Japan to a somewhat higher level, but only about 50%. So pretty clearly something's happened there in the intervening 20-odd years since we did the NAFTA. It would seem that Ford, and I assume other companies, have rather different looking supply chains than they had back then. But again, I'd say this, I'm not sure, this again speaks to the issue of not really having thought through a vigorous work program, all of the issues which can help contribute to an optimal solution. Another point, and Germain touched on this last night in his remarks, is the utilization rate in free trade agreements. I saw some studies at a conference I was at a week ago in Manila suggesting that some of them have utilization rates as low as 25%. And I know that even in the NAFTA, it's still the case that many companies have decided that it's cheaper to pay the American MFN duty than to bother to figure out whether they comply with the rules of origin. So there's something there that isn't quite right in terms of how the system works. That wasn't quite how it was supposed to be. Let me say something about regional agreements and dispute settlement. And this has also been touched on quite a bit in yesterday's discussion. And of course, I'm one of those pesky people who, with a diplomatic, political background, who meddles in dispute settlement. But I actually was quite deeply involved both in the Tokyo round and the Uruguay round and the negotiations on dispute settlement. And but let's look at the regional agreements. So when we negotiated the NAFTA, we thought, gee, we've got these really pretty good dispute settlement provisions in the NAFTA for intergovernmental disputes. And we thought, that really could work pretty well. But it didn't, as you know. And for really, one reason was that a sort of technical problem, that the whole system would have worked quite automatically if we'd been able to reach agreement on the roster of panelists. But when we couldn't do that, then it became a very ad hoc process trying to develop the membership of a panel. But the other reasons were more fundamental. And one was, especially when coupled, and there was discussion of this yesterday, with the clause in the NAFTA that says a NAFTA member can choose either NAFTA or the WTO for dispute settlement purposes on a particular issue, but not both. This led people to think, well, my goodness, let me see now, if there are several countries who have been adversely affected by an American measure, and they include countries outside the NAFTA area, perhaps, say, for instance, the European Union and Japan, among others, and it appears that they're going to bring a dispute in the WTO. Would it make sense for Canada to bring a dispute in the NAFTA? Supposing we got a less satisfactory outcome than the people who brought the complaint in the WTO. That might be a little bit difficult to explain domestically and to manage. But another, and I think perhaps even more fundamental reason why the regional trade agreement dispute process has not worked as well, and why the WTO remains the default system, and that is these regional agreements don't really have an effective secretariat. And we'll see how the world evolves, but my record, certainly during the NAFTA negotiations, there was no interest on the part of the United States in having any kind of NAFTA institutional machinery of any significance. So in the WTO, what, Gabrielle? 3 divisions supporting the dispute process involving how many? 60? 65? So that's an enormous resource. And these people are very talented, experienced. They assist panels with research, looking into past precedent, and with drafting reports. So the difference between that kind of system and a system where you might be able to get good panelists, but they really have no support in terms of how they do their work, which is going to work better and more effectively. Now, let me say something about new issues, and this will go faster than you might think. So first of all, what are these new issues, and have people begun discussing them? Well, yes, they have begun discussing them. And indeed, even inside the WTO, they're being discussed. They're just not really being discussed as issues that are ripe for negotiation. And so, for instance, in the Geneva Ministerial Conference in 2011, it's instructive to read the chairman's summing up of the meeting. And as part of that, there's a section on current global challenges, which actually mentions a series of these new issues. Another place where you can find this sort of information in the WTO is in the annual World Trade Reports, which each year address a different and important theme in international commerce. And I think when you look through those, it's worth doing, you can find a number of ideas that would lend themselves to further discussion and perhaps eventual conclusion and negotiation. And then I thought, well, maybe I should have a look at what our major trading partner is up to. So I looked at the Trade Promotion Authority that was signed into law by President Obama on June 29th. And I won't bore you with all the details, but there are 13 what are called overall trade negotiating objectives. There are 21 principal negotiating objectives, and together these objectives cover 13 pages of single-spaced statute. So there's quite a bit to look at there in terms of thinking about what the future might hold. And of course, this law will continue to give negotiating authority, if it's extended, which is quite a simple process, to the President of the United States until July 1, 2021. So this takes us fairly well off into the future. Now let me give four examples of new issues. And I'm going to start with global value chains, because I think this is something that has changed really dramatically since 1980, in those 35 years. And investment is obviously a key driver in global value chains, in addition to trade. Now, I looked at the World Investment Report, the UNCTAD's World Investment Report for 2014. There's some very interesting statistics in it on sales by foreign affiliates as a percentage of global GDP, and then looking also at the similar figures for export of goods and services as a percentage of global GDP. So in 1990, sales by foreign affiliates accounted for 21% of global GDP. 21%, 1990. By 2013, that figure was 46%, more than double, nearly 50% of global GDP. If you look at exports of goods and services, in 1990, as a percentage of GDP, it was 18%. And in 2013, it was 31%. So it's gone up. It's still significant, but it's much less significant than sales by foreign affiliates. So it would appear that in terms of the integration of economies, that investment has become a more important medium of international business relations than trade. And I think we really need to begin thinking and do some imaginative work in terms of how to make the WTO more responsive to these ideas. There are no facile solutions here because these are very complicated problems. We didn't develop the ideas of how to approach the Uruguay round overnight. It took us 6 years of hard slogging, as I described earlier. Now, it's obvious, I think, that global value chains, that, looking at whether investment should become part of a WTO agreement, that's an important part of that. I think you could make a strong argument that restrictive business practices ought to be part of that discussion, because if companies are assuming this kind of importance in terms of how markets are being developed, then this is an area I think we should look at. And lastly, we need new statistical approaches to understanding what's going on. So I think the work that the WTO has done and the OECD on trade and value-added goods is particularly important. And I think we should find a way of making that more relevant to trade negotiators. And in Canada, I would suggest that means telling Statistics Canada that they've got to figure out how to produce this information in a more timely fashion, because it gives a very different impression, very different information about what's important in terms of our trading relationships and in terms of the products that we're selling in international markets. So if you don't know what's going on, it's pretty hard to negotiate a good agreement. That's my first one. That's the biggest one in terms of new business, as I would sort of see it right now, that we need to come to grips with. A second one is the trade effects of reducing carbon emissions. And this was talked about quite a bit yesterday. I'm not going to go into it in any further detail other than to say there could hardly be a more important issue in terms of today's global relationships. And I think the WTO really needs to begin to think about how to address that much more seriously than it has so far. Now I'm going to talk about, this isn't really a new issue, but it's kind of a new issue because it's been ignored for a while, and that's the impact of domestic regulations on international trade. And of course, this is picked up dealt with in the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade. It's dealt with in the SPS agreement. But it's totally absent from the Doha Declaration. And of course, it's going to be a principal focus, or is a principal focus apparently, in the TTIP negotiations. So I think there's more work that's needed there in terms of thinking about how do we bring the WTO back into that game. There have been some very good discussions in the Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade, and you can read these reports on the WTO website. But there hasn't been thought as to how you factor this into a major reordering of WTO priorities for the future. And the fourth point I would mention is export restrictions and security, what I'll call security of supply issues, about the security of supply of primary industrial and agricultural commodities. Now, interestingly enough, some of these issues were taken up in the Tokyo round after the Arab oil embargo in 1974, and a number of ideas were advanced at that time, including by the Canadian delegation, in terms of how to try to negotiate on these matters. And I think perhaps the time has come to go back and take another look at some of these issues. Now, I'm not going to go any further. That's it in terms of what I'm going to list. But there are obviously a lot of other issues out there that need to be looked at as part of the new agenda. I would add that those four I've just mentioned would seem to me that you can make a very strong argument that those would be better served by global solutions than bilateral or regional solutions. So, okay, I did mention that Mr. Harper is partly responsible for having me here today. We're having elections in Canada, for those of you who don't know. And it seems to me that there's a real opportunity here for the new Canadian government, and it will be a new government whoever wins, elected on October 19th, to really begin to take another look at Canada's international trade agenda, and in particular at how to approach the future of the WTO. Now, there are a number of people I know, including a number of people in Canada, who think Canada can't really make a difference in that kind of discussion. Well, I disagree with that very fundamentally, and I think what you heard last night and what Germain and I have talked about over the last few hours suggests that indeed Canada has made an important contribution in the past, and I think we can do so again in the future. But it requires a commitment by the government to deciding that that's an important priority and to putting the resources and support into allowing Canadians to become actively involved in that constructive look at how we move towards the future. Quite clearly, we need to start thinking about what sort of WTO do we want 20 years from now. You know, I used to think 20 years was a long time, but having just described the fact that, you know, we're now 35 years away from something I remember being engaged in from the outset, makes me realize that actually 20 years isn't that long at all. I have real difficulty believing this is the 20th anniversary of the WTO. I have had difficulty a year ago believing it was the 20th anniversary of the NAFTA. So if we don't start now with solid work, we're not going to be ready to meet the challenges that are going to come at us over the next 20 years. And with that, I will stop and thank you again for the opportunity of being able to share these thoughts with you today. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weeks, for those inspirational ideas. Nous avons le temps pour, peut-être si vous voulez revenir à l'avant, nous avons le temps pour une ou deux brèves questions. Je ne sais pas si des gens souhaitent réagir au discours de M. Weeks. Oui. Nathalie, s'il vous plaît. On a un micro. Merci.
Nathalie Latulippe, je suis du ministère de la Justice du Québec. J'aurais une question pour vous dans les nouvelles idées à explorer là, pour les 20 prochaines années. Vous avez mentionné tout ce qui concerne les restrictions qui sont faites du fait des entreprises elles-mêmes. Je me demandais si vous pourriez élaborer un peu là-dessus, parce que c'est un peu un constat qu'on fait en discutant avec une amie ici qui est aussi spécialiste des questions de commerce international. On se dit que bon, l'État est très réglementé, mais les entreprises elles-mêmes entretiennent souvent des comportements anticoncurrentiels, par exemple, puis ils ne font pas l'objet de beaucoup de restrictions ou de contrôles. Donc j'aurais aimé ça si vous pouviez élaborer là-dessus.
Well, I think, you know, that's what has to happen over the next few years. People have to elaborate on that. But just to put a little bit more into the mix, you know, the Doha round already has work going on competition policy issues, more in terms of discussion than real negotiation. We've seen an increasing tendency to putting competition policy provisions into international trade agreements. And that's the case in the NAFTA, a very general one. But I gather in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's perhaps under that kind of heading that the treatment of state-owned enterprises will be addressed. There's also been work in the past at thinking about whether we could replace trade remedies, particularly anti-dumping, with some form of international competition policy. After all, it's through competition policy that domestically that countries address those issues. Why not move to the same approach internationally? And it could make for a healthier system, I would argue. But there are obviously entrenched forces which don't think it's a very good idea. So I don't know whether I can really say anything more about that now. But what struck me as I began thinking about my remarks today and thinking about global value chains is that with so much of international trade now taking place within companies and through global value chains with very close connections, that there could be a lot of opportunity there for abusive practices. And perhaps we need to be thinking about how to address those questions.
Merci. D'autres? Oui, Charles?
Yeah, perhaps a naive question from a lawyer to a diplomat.
Now I'm really suspicious.
No. To what extent is it not possible to say that, well, the Doha round will not end, and to just say, well, let's end it? To what extent is it not becoming less it loses all credibility because we postponed, it's supposed to be finished in 2005 and this and that, and we're now 14 years. I mean, things have changed since we even conceived what has been ill-conceived from the beginning, as you said, without preparatory work. Is it something that could be a solution, or it makes no sense and we have to save the appearances, or could we just say, well, let's stop and start again?
It's not a naive question at all. I think that the problem is that, well, it's also the Doha development agenda. So it's been so intimately connected with the notion of development that to declare it a failure is going to carry some difficult connotations in terms of managing relationships between developed and developing countries in the WTO. On the other hand, and I mean, I would be happy if I was, found to be wrong and they did reach a conclusion to the Doha round in December, but I don't see this happening. I think at some point it actually becomes destructive not to acknowledge that we've failed and to say that we need to start over again, or that we need to start looking at new work. I think one of the problems that a number of developing countries see is they think this is sort of a trap they'll fall into. The developed countries will say, well, sorry, the Doha development agenda is over. We got a few benefits out of it, like the trade facilitation agreement, but those negotiations are now over. They were unsuccessful. We have to acknowledge that. And have we got some good ideas for how we're going to fix you in the next negotiations? So there's a bit of that concern out there. So I think this needs to be very carefully managed. But I think the world would really be remiss if we didn't start looking at a very vigorous sort of work program agenda in the WTO. One of the problems actually, and it's been associated with the single undertaking too, I think, is that countries have been afraid to have a discussion in the WTO. In the run-up to the Uruguay round, we also had an informal consultative group called the CG18 in the GATT. And that was serviced by the Secretariat. It had discussions with senior officials from capitals with a lot of important issues. That also helped contribute to launching the Uruguay round. It's really difficult to have that kind of discussion now in the WTO because a lot of countries think that if they start talking about an issue, it's sort of going to be taken down as evidence and used against them later. And the dispute settlement system has assumed such a big importance that people are afraid to negotiate because they might be laying down unfortunate precedents in the negotiating history. So I think we have to address some of these questions. For some people who, I remember when I was ambassador, and some people would say this to me, effectively what I just said. And I said, well, look, why don't we build into the dispute settlement understanding a reference to the fact that nothing that's used in discussions in the WTO can be considered in the dispute settlement process. That would deal with that. And there's already a similar kind of provision. I forget what it's on. It slips my mind. But so yes, I think we need to put it behind us. We need to move on. But the way we manage that is going to have to be very carefully done.
Oui, une dernière question rapide. Monsieur Tremblay.
Moi, Tremblay, je suis avocat à Québec. J'aimerais avoir votre opinion, vos impressions. L'ALENA a été conclu 1 an avant l'OMC et l'OMC 1 an après l'ALENA, naturellement. Quelles ont été les influences de l'un sur l'autre? Parce qu'il y a quand même des similarités entre l'ALENA et l'OMC et vous, en fait, donc, traitement SPS, que l'on rappelle d'autres choses aussi.
Considerable. I mean, I had the interesting situation of having been Canada's ambassador to the GATT during the Uruguay round until just after the Brussels meeting, so early 1991. I then went back to Ottawa and became the chief negotiator for the NAFTA. And then when I finished that, my reward was getting to manage Canada-US relations for 2 years. And then they sent me back to Geneva again as ambassador to the World Trade Organization. So I've sort of walked both sides of the street and not one, and having to go back again to the other environment. I think the NAFTA negotiations were made much easier by the fact that basically the WTO negotiations had been largely completed by the time we got into the intensive part of the NAFTA negotiations. The NAFTA negotiation, by the way, the negotiation on the NAFTA itself took 14 months. Pretty good compared with the length of time it's taking some agreements more recently. And that was a precedent agreement in terms of what it contained. But the fact that we had a highly advanced text on services, even though we used a negative list in the NAFTA and a positive list approach in the WTO, that certainly helped. The intellectual property provisions in the Dunkel text, which was out by the time we were addressing that in the NAFTA, meant that we were able to the Americans wanted to go further, but we said we won't go any further than Doha. Than the Uruguay round. So then Dunkel. So basically what we did is we just imported all of those intellectual property provisions from the Dunkel text into the NAFTA. And I could go on. But plus I think the fact that we were looking at a major liberalizing effort made it easier to consider liberalizing trade with a significant developing country with a lot of export potential.
Merci, M. Wick. Des nombreux messages que vous nous livrez, je retiens, entre autres, que le Canada est un leader dans l'avancée du droit international économique et il l'est depuis longtemps et doit continuer de l'être. Merci beaucoup.